Hello and welcome back to the Dukascopa Studios here in Geneva. I'm joined today by Maria Khodynskaya from the mission of the Russian Federation to the United Nations. So Maria, welcome to the studios.
Thank you.
So how would you describe the current security situation in the Middle East and in particular Syria?
Well, the situation in the Middle East is terrible, and we don't only talk about Syria or Iraq here or Libya. I think the whole region, unfortunately, is sliding into chaos. We can start with Libya, and then Sinai, and then Gaza, then Lebanon, Syria, Iraq. Unfortunately, we see some instability in the Gulf, and Yemen, which is just broken by the civil war. So Libya is falling apart. We have two governments, two parliaments in Tripoli and Tobruk. We have animosity and hostility between tribes. We have a lot of Islamists. We have Islamic State well based in Derna and trying to get Sirte because if they get Sirte, they will have access to oil production. And that means that they will have a stable source, a stable income, financial income. Syria is torn apart. The government is fighting against fighting with terrorism, Islamic State, Jabhat al-Nusra, and other groups. Absolutely the same situation we see in Iraq, where I think 1/3 minimum of the country is taken already by Islamic State. So it's a very gloomy picture. It's a very gloomy picture, and of course it has repercussions that go out of the region. We see the migrant crisis in Europe. All these migrants come from the Middle East, unfortunately, and Africa. We of course see that the economies of these countries have been ruined, and people have no perspective whatsoever.
And then looking at Russia, so in Russia's opinion, what can be done to curb the current threats, and what's Russia's plan and the world's reaction to Russia's plan?
We do have a plan, we do have a proposal. This proposal, if I'm not mistaken, was first pronounced in June this year by President Putin during his meeting with Minister of Defense of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. It's a very practical and simple plan. There are certain differences in political sphere among different countries on how to settle the Syrian crisis. We cannot agree until now. But there is the terrorist threat, and this threat is common because the terrorists already say that they are going to conquer Europe, conquer Russia, etc. So it's a common threat, terrorism. So what we are proposing is, now we have a situation where there are some forces that fight terrorism on the ground, that fight Islamic State and Jabhat al-Nusra on the ground. Syrian army, Iraqi army, Kurds, and Syrian armed opposition groups. Syrian, it's important, not groups that involve a lot of foreign fighters. They are already doing that on the ground, so why don't we help them to unite against the common threat? It's a common knowledge that different countries can have certain leverage on different actors on the ground. For example, Russia and Iran have a certain leverage on the Syrian government, United States and Turkey on some armed groups. So why don't we unite forces and help these people on the ground to fight terrorism? And after that, we can talk on how to organize life in this country. At the same time, we are open for political process, and we have already held several meetings between the Syrian government and Syrian opposition in Moscow. We are also working very closely with UN Special Envoy in Syria, Staffan de Mistura. He is now planning to launch 4 groups that will involve Syrian government representative and Syrian opposition, that will talk on different dimensions of the settlement of the crisis in Syria, fight against terrorism, humanitarian, political, etc. So we're ready also to engage in these efforts. It's no doubt about that. But the main thrust of our initiative is let's help all together people on the ground to fight terrorism. The reaction was in general positive. We see interest from our partners, but some of them say that, we cannot do that because the Syrian government is not legitimate, so we're not going to cooperate with this government, even if we talk about fight against terrorism. We don't believe in that, because last year there was a big process of destruction of Syrian chemical weapons carried out. It was a US-Russia initiative, and then the whole process of destruction of chemical weapons of Syria involved many stakeholders, many states, including Western states. This process was carried out under the auspices of the United Nations and Organization of Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. And during this process, the Western countries were perfectly fine in talking to the Syrian government, cooperating on a daily basis with the Syrian government, because everyone had an interest to implement this initiative. So now when we talk about another initiative, another Russian initiative on fight against terrorism, we hope that it should be possible, because it's a common threat, and we don't believe in such things when they say that here it's legitimate, there it's not legitimate. I mean, it's politics. It's not serious to say these things. So we really believe that our partners are reasonable people, and after some time they would agree. But we see big interest.
Absolutely. So in regards to Syria then, what are the most negative impacts on the Syrian economy and on the humanitarian situation?
Well, everything. I mean, the war, the terrorist acts in Syria, then, of course, sanctions. Some of our colleagues talk a lot about, humanitarian tragedy in Syria, and it is a humanitarian tragedy. And that a lot should be done, more should be done to help the Syrian people. Yes, of course, but at the same time, we shouldn't believe that. We shouldn't forget that Syria until now is under unilateral sanctions from the EU, from the United States. We think it's unfair because, according to the UN data, the sanctions provoked 80% drop of the trade and industry in Syria, 45% of oil revenues, and 60% of gross domestic product drop. These countries that are so worried about humanitarian sufferings of the Syrian people should also rethink their policy, in my opinion, and consider lifting these sanctions. Of course, all the situation in the region, it ruins the economy, and it's all interrelated. Syria and Iraq, again, let me underline, they face the same situation. They combat terrorism, but in Iraqi case, the international community is supporting the legitimate government of Iraq in its fight against Islamic State. In Syria, it says that the government is not legitimate. So these double standards should be also rethought, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Well, Maria, thank you so much for coming in today and sharing such a significant topic with us. It was a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. For all the latest Dukascopy updates, do keep clicking back. Goodbye for now.